So when I first started to think about this, I started to think about other kinds of contexts where you have a long-standing multi-generational struggle of what is typically initially framed as a minority community that is struggling against a larger majoritarian community. And how, in the course of these multi-generational struggles in that way, there typically is a moment at which the whole framework of viewing the question gets inverted or flipped around. So in the European context, for instance, for several hundred years, European philosophers and political theorists and legal theorists continued to write pieces on what was called at the time the Jewish question. And it really wasn't until the horrors of the Second World War that that got completely inverted, where people began to accept the widespread notion that, in fact, there was not and had never been a Jewish problem within Europe, but rather there was an anti-Semitism problem. A similar kind of thing has played out in the context of the United States, where for 150 years people wrote articles and debated about the question of what was, in the language of the time, called the Negro question. And one major moment in the whole struggle over the last century has been to try again to flip that around and to say, in fact, the United States does not and has never had a Negro problem in the United States, but rather it is a problem of white supremacy, a problem, of course, which is resurgent now in the most vile ways. I think that what's been happening in Canada over the last 50 years is basically an attempt to try to change the whole frame of reference, to flip the script, so to speak, so that we no longer think about this question as, in a sense, the Indian question, but rather think about it as the question of white supremacy and settler colonialism on this land. When we do that, it completely alters the whole framework and the whole problematic for thinking about the question of reconciliation. It's no longer really a question of how to reconcile Indigenous peoples into this society, but rather how to reconcile this society with itself. How can Canada come to reconcile with itself is, in a sense, the fundamental question when it comes to decolonizing the white supremacist and settler colonial roots of this country. So I think if you think about it in that way, you begin to think about the basic constitutive tensions or contradictions that are at the heart of a society like this. And that's what I mean when I say one way of framing this is to think about the problem of how to reconcile Canada with itself. Because what you're trying to do then is resolve constitutive or fundamental tensions or contradictions at the heart of this society. And I think there are basically two kinds of contradictions of different orders or different sorts. The first of these is basically a contradiction between the explicitly held normative principles or the fundamental ideals that the society espouses and its actual practices. So this is a contradiction essentially between what it is we say and what it is we do. The most famous example of this comes out of the US context, where you can think, for instance, of how the founders and the writers of the Constitution of the United States claim to espouse the fundamental equality as a self-evident truth, that all men were created equal, and yet in all kinds of ways, in all the actual institutional practices of that society, they facilitated slavery, native dispossession and genocide, other forms of gender and sexualized hierarchies. So what you had there was, in the constitutional framework, the commitment to a set of basic normative principles, but in the actual institutionalized practices of that society, something quite different. And that creates a kind of fundamental contradiction at the heart of the society, which, when left unchecked or when left to fester, can actually produce a wider spread crisis of legitimacy, as more and more citizens come to realize that their society does not live up to the basic norms and ideals that it espouses. I think in Canada we have something like that. I think that Canada espouses as a basic normative principle the rule of law and the principled idea of collective self-determination. The whole idea of Canada, the whole existence of the country, its differentiation, for instance, from the United States, is predicated on the idea of collective self-determination of people. And yet at every turn, Canada has undermined, in all kinds of ways, the collective self-determination of the other nations that coexist, that exist on this continent along with us. And so that just leads to a basic fundamental contradiction between the supposed norms or ideals that are held by the society as a whole, particularly espoused in sort of meta-theoretical documents like the Constitution, and the actual practices of that society, a gap between what it is we say and what it is we do. But I think that there is another kind of contradiction that is also deeply woven into this society that is even harder to reconcile or even harder for us to get around. And I think that this is different from the first because it's not so much a contradiction between what it is we say and what it is we do, but a contradiction between two different things that we're doing. So I think that in any sufficiently complex society, there are different kinds of subsystems within that society that operate under different normative principles and different organizing logics. So what I have in mind is something like having a political and juridical sphere that has its own principles and norms of regulation, its own logic of operation on the one hand, versus say an economic sphere with different norms, different practices, different institutional logics, maybe a religious sphere or a cultural sphere, an aesthetic sphere, and so on. And what can happen is these basic systems within the society come to be in fundamental tension or contradiction with one another. And that becomes a deep problem of resolution within the society. I think that the so-called problem of reconciling indigenous peoples is partially at least an effect of a more fundamental contradiction internal to Canadian society. And that contradiction is between a juridical and political order that espouses and tries to institutionalize something like Aboriginal title on the one hand, and an economic system that is predicated upon unlimited expansion and growth. The capitalist economic system within this society is constitutionally structured in such a way that it requires continuous expansion and growth, the continuous acquisition of new resources, new bodies, and new markets for its purposes. This leads it into a fundamental tension with the espoused ideals and institutionalized practices of recognizing and affirming Aboriginal title, because there's simply no way to recognize Aboriginal title as a fundamental underlying title to this country, while at the same time continually expanding and growing a capitalist system that exploits and plunders the land for different purposes that run in contradiction to these basic legal norms. If that's the case, then we have a much deeper problem than the first problem I mentioned, the problem between what it is we say and what it is we do. It's not so much a problem of hypocrisy, that we sort of say one thing and do another, but rather that we have different kinds of systems operating within the society on their own independent logics, but these logics cannot be reconciled with one another. If that's the case, then before we can even begin to think about the issue of reconciliation in relation to Indigenous peoples, Canada must think fundamentally and seriously about how it's going to reconcile itself with itself.
I can articulate to Rob's problematizing of the tension or the contradiction or the reveal that is posed by reconciliation as a project. I see it as doing very, very strategic, cunning political work. I see it as using the trauma and pain that has been inflicted upon us, produced by a state as it comes into being, to strategically manage its own life form in the present. I see it as also in its recourse to the language of healing, which we saw with the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, which I think was a key part of this neoliberal theocracy that is now in play, of setting the stage for what is now an emotional bloodletting that has impeded the critique that is needed on the table for a robust understanding of politics in the present, but also other political possibilities. I don't think it's fair to expect us all to want to reconcile. Reconciliation requires harmonizing, what some theorists call commensurating, making, who are they? The accountants, right? Talk about reconciling a ledger. I think pain and suffering is not reconcilable with settler sovereignty. So to me, I appreciate very much Rob's accounting, not to call him an accountant, although to maybe make him blush a bit, accounting of the tension. I think indeed we can look at this as a kind of normative impasse. But I think the project, or the way I'm seeing it unfold, is simply impossible and yet irresistible. And I want to go off right now because I've been writing about him, because I'm just so disgusted. The handsome new prince of the white paper, the son of the sun. If I can be coy and Shakespearean for a minute. And his irresistibility, not only to white queer publics, the boys love him, but also I think everybody seems to love him. He was the next great thing. He's also pro-pipelines. He will rape our land. He is raping our land. And I don't know what to say yet about this inquiry, which needs to be better than it is, right? But out of respect for the families, I won't go further. But either way, I won't go off on that tangent, although it is a piece of the book and I'm starting to write about him. But the thing I want to say in terms of this emotional history or this emotional project of governance, which is what I see this as, is it's a fantastic political ruse to keep extracting, to keep dispossessing, and to keep us in our place. But to keep us in our place now as wounded subjects that are supposed to be simultaneously healing and restoring a state that I think, in fact, is not restorable, right? And so my question would be, and I don't have the answer, so you can hate me for that. My question would be, what are the other possibilities, right? Are there other possibilities beyond this therapeutic healing model, which I think does some good work for people who need to talk, but it also, I think, pathologizes politics and militarized struggles in way, and also pathologizes the necessity of critique, because there is not a critical impulse in suffering, right? It is a supplicant position. It is not a critical position. So I'm quite irritated by it intellectually, but I do think it is a productive site, I think, of interrogation. And the project for us, for those of us who are alive to this and are trying to think about it in ways that are respectful of our parents and our grandparents who went through this system, who find some relief in this model, to also keep an eye on what is going on before us, what is going on with electoral politics, what is going on with this new son of the sun, and also what we are to do intellectually and politically as citizens of our nations. What I don't like about the survivor discourse is that it removes these people from their nations, from their polities, from their families, and reinscribes them as survivors. And I get that that is can be a position of empowerment, but it also removes them from the very, I think, interruptive and challenging position of a First Nations or Indigenous citizenship in the face of a state that would still have us disappear. So rather than disappear our political specificities into this category of survivor or descendant or whatever, I think we might want to intellectually, politically, carefully, gently somehow think about the work that's being done with this relanguaging and this re-subjectivizing by by the state and also within our own communities.
In Redskin White Mass, I obviously take on the language of recognition and reconciliation, which often are paired or almost synonymous. And I do so by doing a political history of the emergence of recognition and reconciliation in this country, which I claim has two kind of fundamental sort of issues that are attempting to be resolved in that emergence. One, as in all contexts where reconciliation emerges as an industry or institutional apparatus, is the question of violence. So the state is attempting to restate itself as the sole, in a Weberian sense, legitimate executor of political violence. This either comes in the wake of previous violences that has destabilized and decentered that sole legitimacy, or in the case of Canada, in attempting to curtail the emergence of an uprising violence that was due largely to an increase in Indigenous militancy from the 1970s into the 1980s, which culminated in Oka, and then you see the crystallization of this institutional form of reconciliation in the terms of reference, particularly for the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and then it catches on and takes on its own life. The second and related issue that's always at play when reconciliation comes into public discourse has to do with, and I think Rob's right here, capitalism and flows of capital accumulation. So simultaneously in that emergence of militancy demonstrated by Indigenous nations through the 70s and 80s was also a tactic which was attempting to block flows of capital by establishing Indigenous presence in those capital circuits. So this is the blockade, this is land-based direct action, this is all these sorts of things. And that creates, in the language of the state, economic uncertainty, which needs to be reconciled or addressed. So you have the potential bloodbath scenario with economic divestment and disinvestment and economic uncertainty, and then in all contexts around the world to varying degrees, where reconciliation is deployed as a public discourse, you'll see those two things at play. And in Rob's sense, they're supposed to create that economic certainty that gains access and security to those lands in an orderly and non-confrontational or violent sort of fashion. So in that context, I kind of map out that history and look at some of the subjective or affective issues at play in that reconciliation as a language wants to pathologize, and that's Indigenous people's anger, our resentment, our unwillingness to get over the past. We're suffering from this legacy that we can't heal ourselves from, therefore reconciliation, and I show how it is a generative of critical sort of Indigenous resistance and thought. So, like my co-panelists here, we're not really friends of this language or apparatus. And my newer work kind of, rather than looking at the afterlives of reconciliation, so what comes after, is to pay attention more historically to its previous lives. What were the sort of relationships, the kind of theorizing, the deep engagement with other ideas and other peoples that form the core of that militancy that reconciliation came in to pacify. And this has taken me to look at kind of the unspoken histories or subaltern histories of Red power in Canada. And in particular, the relationship between third and fourth world solidarity movements and theorizing and the kind of international basis and Indigenous people's relationship to the international core and base of global anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism. And we'll see an interesting take on relationship if we want to think of reconciliation as some sort of relationship. And it was during these movements in the 60s and 70s and then started to kind of become a little bit more passive in the 1980s, where we were not concerned with reconciling with Canadians. We had little concern with reconciling with the state. We had little concern with reconciling with a hegemonic whiteness. What we were attempting to do was forge relationships with the wretched of the earth. We were attempting to forge relationships with the darker nations. And it was this international mobilization which involved the influence of Fanon and Mao on inner city Vancouver Red Power movements like the Native Alliance for Red Power, which influenced the early Squamish organizers, labor organizers, who are aligning themselves with international militant labor organizations like the Workers of the World, so the Wobblies, which informed George Manuel's early internationalism, which was established in relationship to the non-aligned movement, as influenced through the work of Marie Smallface Marule and her work in Africa, established tangible relationships and friendships with people in Tanzania, the People's Republic of China, which also influenced the Dene radicalism of the 1970s, which was both influenced by, obviously, Cuba, but more importantly, Tanzania and the People's Republic. And we would travel there. These ideas would, from kind of Marxist third worldism, would percolate amongst our young militants, and not replace indigenous traditions, but would provide a supplementary frame from which we would develop a combative consciousness, not one that was conciliatory to the circuits of accumulation of capital, of land dispossession, and other systemic forms of state and patriarchal control that the reconciliation discourse nowadays is profoundly complicit in, if not an important ideological reproducer of. So it's it's the pre-lives, I think, of reconciliation that we need to examine more thoroughly and kind of really sort of critically engage with those relationships that this kind of conciliatory path that we're on is attempting to erase from our lived memory.